Papyrus is a quarterly journal on the techniques of art and culture in Africa. And he is the founder of neatspace.com, a portal for disseminating scientific and mathematical foundations of African art and architecture. He is a principal partner of Digitalite, Digitalite.inc. And his talk is going to be on the future of architecture and technologies in Africa. Dr. Dean, you have the floor. Can you unmute Dr. Dean, please?
He can also unmute himself.
Dr. Dean, can you unmute yourself, please? We can hear you. Can you unmute him? Because he's talking.
Okay, fine.
Okay, go on, Dr. Dean. You're welcome.
To introduce myself? Or what?
No, just go on. I've introduced you.
To present?
Yes, please.
It will be difficult because you should give me 2 minutes in order to put my...
Okay, go on. Take you 2 minutes to put your slides on.
Go ahead.
Bon. So I need to leave first.
Okay.
Give me 2 minutes to leave.
Okay. Can you unmute Professor Jayoba, please? Whilst we wait for Dr. Dean.
Hello.
Oh, we hear you. I hear you. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
Okay, so we can hear you.
All right, all right.
So do you have anything to say? Because the doctor wanted to go to you until Edward was ready.
Yes, I'm ready.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. Am I supposed to present now?
I think it was just going to be an introduction, you know.
Okay.
Okay.
While we wait for Dr. Dean to come back on, I'll introduce Professor Hughes, and he will go on with his presentation whilst Dr. Dean comes back on, because he needs to present his slides himself. Sorry about the mix-up. So I take Professor Hughes, and Professor David Hughes is an architect, is a professor of architecture, who began the 50-year of world travel to architectural sites in 1967. With over 50 built projects to his credit, he has contributed immensely to a wide body of research focused on African contribution to world architecture. Today we welcome Professor Dean and Professor David Hughes to present for us Afrocentric Architecture Revisited. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I need to be able to pull my slides. I think you just make me the host and then I can go from there. Okay, great. Great. All right, so now I want to share the screen and I have this presentation that I will start from the beginning. And I start with, you know, what Afrocentric architecture is as a definition. Part of the introduction may have missed that, you know, I authored this theoretical premise that there could be a distinct way in which we could find a design that results in a distinct manifestation of architecture in the modern built environment. This is not to rework, indigenous forms or elements from the past, but to build going forward. But that we would be inspired to design from historical, environmental, and/or cultural elements that have origins in the continent of Africa. So, let's see, my next slide. Let's see, let me do it this way. Okay, so this just shows the book and myself, let's see, is something stopping me from doing it? Okay, so the endeavor started with global travel to sites focused on Africa through many years. It also started with the idea that a theory has to be viable and relevant. So a theory about Africa's contribution to the world of architecture as a design element had to first pass the hurdle or the portal that Africa had anything worthy in the world of global architecture to show. And so we started off first with the great history of Africa, including the very first monumental works, not only the first, but the greatest, and they still remain as such, starting in Kemet, going throughout with temples, with great works of engineering. And then we had to move beyond just Kemet because so many cultures have attempted to claim it for themselves. And that's a good thing in that we're very proud of the fact that our contributions to architecture is so significant that the rest of the world wanted a piece of it. But we wanted to show that Africa was more than just the Kemetic dynasty. We went to Ethiopia, we went to the south, to Great Zimbabwe, we went to the west, the great cities of Timbuktu and Janae, and then we looked at some very distinct cultural regions, like the Dogon region in Mali, in which you find extraordinary building forms and types. And so now we can move forward and say, all right, what has ever been done with Africa's contributions to architecture? And we can go around the world and we can see that, the great Kemetic obelisk suddenly becomes the centerpiece of the today most powerful nation in the world. Washington, D.C., and its own government, salutes itself, with an African element. We can go to France, which at one time was all art, or at least that was the claim that they made. And they had to find some of the greatest pieces of their own work in the modern world, influenced by Africa. But these pieces were what I call distinct, even though modern, they were historical adaptations. We go beyond adaptation. We look at distinct pieces. These pieces, in fact, over the years, influenced great movements in Western architecture and art. But we still said, we have our own. And we've also seen where our own architects have taken these things and have been doing this for years. So when I always present this, I point out that this is not new. It's only new to those of us who have allowed ourselves and the training that we embrace to ignore what has already been done and what is being done. So when I did this work, and I started more than 30 years ago in terms of the writing, I indeed moved the needle, if you will. One of the reasons I think my work gained traction was because I now come out of the West itself. I come out of America itself. And I'm a scholar and a professor, and what I'm doing is I'm saying, no, Africa has a place. And I bring the authority from this side of the waters that sometimes people seek in order to validate what's happening in Africa. Well, I said, no, we're going to do it, and we're going to say Africa has an important place. So now this building here, if you've been to Burkina Faso, this is in Ouagadougou, the modern one, of course, and it was designed by Pierre Wango Sawadogo. And what he did was he took from that region the forms that already existed in the Dogon region. A lot of people call these cliff dwellings. I won't get into the minute, just what they are, but you have to do this homework. But the forms and the architecture is what I concentrated on most of all. Last year, I had the opportunity to visit Nigeria. I had been there 30 years ago and have a chance to do the kind of work I did last year under the auspices of CPDI, and you'll hear from the founder of that organization. But when I went there, I found that there's still this hesitancy, this reservation to say that Africa can still do things that are inspired and have been inspired by their own cultural elements, just because nobody said it was. So people ask me, what do you think? And what I've done over the years is what I've coined, and what I've found now after many years of being sort of, I'd say, chided for using the term, which photo documentation, now it's being used universally in scholarship, that you can take pictures and from the pictures draw inferences and comparisons and analyses and so on. So I did that, and I said, no, here are some of the things that I see in your past and I see in your present and in the future. But to get this going as a design theory, it has to be taught. You have to train people. You have to test the theory and then see if it works. So all of this started for me in terms of teaching in 1990 as a Fulbright professor to the Copperbelt University. And anybody want to tell me how much time I have? Because I can move even faster. I still have a minute, 2, 5. Okay, I'll keep going then. Anyway, what I did was, these were students at the Copperbelt who were African. And since I was teaching how to use African elements, all I told them was, your previous thoughts and training said the only architecture that was worth looking at to generate modern buildings was Western architecture. And I said, no. I said, use your own culture and show me what you would do if you had to do something today. This particular student, who is a great architect now, you have to remember that picture that you see in this little inset was taken 30 years ago. He is a premier architect in both Zambia and South Africa, Alik. And he did this, and this particular image that he did has gained traction across many platforms in academia, including the world of fractal design. But he did this by hand to say he wanted to use the typical format of traditional dwellings to create a clinic. That was his sketch. I took this back to America to train dispassionate students of architecture. Dispassionate because they had no immediate connection or immediate drive to see an architecture that's manifesting African elements, but they were good designers. And what I wanted to say was, if I could train them, if I could teach them, then this theory works, because I reject the idea that this is something just for Africans, that only Africans can do. When I say Africans, I mean the diaspora. And I have some of my colleagues and adherents who love what I said, but they insist that this has to be Black architecture. No, it is architecture that can be designed if it is taught and understood by anybody who is a designer. But anyway, started with telling them to pull ideas from different elements or cultural features. This is one. This became a Zulu shield. He morphed it into plan and elevation and 3 dimensions. This was the Bombada headdress. This particular student went on and created this design in a modern built environment. This was a building. I love to show this.
Okay,
Because, sure, am I through?
thank you, Professor. We will stop a bit here so that we'll listen to someone else and then we'll come back again to you. So
Sure.
please, good. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
And going forward, I would like to encourage everyone to kindly write down their questions. We're going to come back to the question and answer sessions so that every speaker will have a time to speak and then we can ask them. So put the name of the speaker you want to answer the questions beside your questions. So we'll go on to the next speaker in the person of Madali Okumabwa, who is the founder of the Community Planning and Design Initiative Africa. It is an initiative specializing in research and development that promotes architecture through exhibition and lectures of new design grounded in African diverse cultures. Madali, thank you for joining us out of your very busy schedule. The floor is yours. We'll listen attentively.
Thank you, Doc. All right, let's share our screen.
Good.
Okay, is everybody seeing?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Thank you, everybody. Glad to be here. You already know who I am, Madali Okumabwa, CPDI. Wanted to share this story from a personal perspective. Everything that we do is centered on us, and that is the best way of looking at the world and how we can make a difference. So the value of African-centered design schools. Prof that just went before is my big mentor, right? Life changed when I met him. Everybody starts out going to school, loving architecture. You pretty much don't realize that anything is off, and then something happens and it's a catalyst and it makes you realize something might be missing from this experience, right? So let me share my story. I'm gonna do a series of stories. I'm in design school, I'm having a blast, I'm designing, I'm learning, I have no idea that anything is missing. One day I go to a Black Architects Conference. This is 25 years ago. I meet Professor David Hughes for the first time. He has just launched his book, Afrocentric Architecture, Design Primer, and he talked about architecture from an African perspective, like you just saw. My mind was blown. I never thought that African culture or identity could be presented in architecture. After all, that is not what I saw in school, right? Okay, so I go back to campus, a third-year design student at this point, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm gonna take the design brief, I'm gonna translate it into, or through a lens, right? My lens, my cultural lens, and present my design. Okay, so now it's jury. We're presenting, you all know how this feels. And my professor says, Madali, this is very interesting, but I'm very sorry. You cannot put Africa and architecture in the same sentence, right? Black people haven't designed anything. What you all do is copy. You copy what we do. What you all have maybe is mud buildings with thatched roofs. If we want to give you Egypt, if Egypt is in Africa, if it was actually designed by Black people, maybe. But Black architects have not contributed anything to the discourse on contemporary architecture. Therefore, your classmates, the Europeans and the Asians, they're valid in bringing their culture to the table. Why? Because their civilizations have evolved their conversation in architecture. Okay, so I was horrified, right? I was horrified. That was a turning point for me, right? So it made me leave design school. I got that degree in urban planning. And then I went to African studies. A major where you could say Africa 1,000 times in one sentence and nobody would have a problem. I wanted to understand where that professor was coming from. Was he right? Was he wrong? Right? I really needed to understand. If I couldn't bring myself to the classroom, then I just would not be in architecture. It didn't take me long to understand where he might have been coming from, right? So we all know Africa's colonized and we're enslaved, we're brought here. By the time they do the universities, help us build universities, and the curriculum in all different aspects, whether it's medicine, whether it's architecture, whatever it is coming from that European lens. So no wonder what we're learning at school is not talking about Africa, right? The curriculums are not African-centered because of what the university set up in those days in the 60s. And not much has changed. All right, so fine, I understood that. So then no wonder when you go out into the built environment, you will see more of this, right? More of this, grandeur, lots of cement, just opulence, right? Not necessarily using local materials, but that's okay, because that's what we've been learning in school. We see less of this, right? Less of this. You see the clay, you see the aesthetics, you see the symbolism, you see the identity. We see more of this, modern architecture, straight lines, no identity. You see all the air conditioned units out there. We see less of this. This is by Pierre Atepa, right? This design, you see, is inspired by artifacts from throughout Africa. What is the Ghanaian stool, the Egyptian headrest? The symbolism is there. We see less of this, but it is happening. If you have been to Ghana, I just went recently. If you're familiar with kente cloth, you might look at this and say, okay, maybe I'm in Ghana, right? Just from the way this building looks. Again, based on what we're learning in our design schools. That's urban. How about rural? The picture on the left shows our traditional building style. If you're going to learn about modifying this a couple of steps upward, maybe you would come up with prototypes that we see on the right, right? If our curriculum were African-centered, right? What would we be learning in school from our own perspective in terms of evolving our architecture, right? This popular story, Abuja, when they were moving the Gwari people out and then building our brand new city, Abuja, they gave them these cement boxes. Of course, they moved in, they understand how to operate in them, they move out in the back, rebuilt their clay buildings, eventually sold these to the civil servants. That's what happens when you have American town planners and Kenzo Tange coming as an architect to help to design Abuja. Were they designing with the people in mind? The prototype on the bottom could have been what they used instead of those clay boxes, right? Lots of images of this. If we're learning in our schools what we should be focusing on, probably African-centered, we'll be talking about designing spaces for those who are moving from the villages, right? Urbanization is on the increase. What we would design for these people. Maybe they would have prototypes that look like this, right? Inexpensive. If we are harvesting that clay, we're making those bricks, we could actually build this instead of this, right? If we're learning in our schools what to build when we graduate, when we go back into our communities and solve the problems that we are facing there. If we're doing African-centered design, we will bring back those elements, right? Culture, like what we heard Professor Oluwatoyin speak about in her presentation, right? The courtyards. Look at the one on the left. This is traditional. It can be done so well. Look at the one on the right, a very contemporary example. Every designer could be learning how to do this in school if it was African-centered, right? Are these elements still important to us? Do they still add value to our lives? Everybody would say yes when you ask, but yes, how do you present it? The image on the right, you look at the same courtyard, same materials, same ambiance. It's beautiful, it's modern, it's African. We could be discussing this in school. I love this example. Being a woman, being in Africa, you're cooking, you're in a cement building. This kitchen on the left, you don't even see a window. You know our food, it's spicy. It's already hot. It's hot inside. But the women go through this because we're not focusing on design for the comfort of our people, right? Most of us. The image on the right is an outdoor kitchen. That's a wonderful experience. The breeze, look at those open spaces. She's outside. It's a family gathering space. It's a wonderful experience, right? Again, focusing on our own personal issues, these things that you bring into classrooms. On the left, there's a bathroom, and there's that expensive jacuzzi. How many of us as Africans or Black people in the diaspora actually fill a tub up and put bubble bath, soak? We don't even have running water most of the time, right? But you're bringing in these expensive elements, taking the cost up, right? The image on the right, you have a shower, very well designed, very comfortable. Whether your water is running or not, you go in there with your bucket, you take your shower, right? Thinking about how we use space, how we actually live. Okay, then let's come to the diaspora. Robert Taylor's beautiful Tuskegee University, for those of you who are aware of it, it's an HBCU, meaning historically Black university. After slavery, the students and the professors actually built their school with their hands. They molded the clay. The pits where they harvested the clay are still there on campus. Now, if I were in a school learning Afrocentric design, one thing I'd like to learn is the African retentions in their building their school. These are Africans that were brought here. Not everything about this colonial building is actually European. A lot of it is African, but we would not know that, right? Unless we're focusing on that in school, right? What were those retentions that those Africans brought here that is embedded in architecture here? They did not just bring people who were farming. They brought scientists and architects, and all of those things translated into their culture here. Or if Afrocentric architecture were part of the curriculum, we will all be learning such, right? This is by Freelon. We all know this building. We see what he was inspired by. The actual element that inspired him is this Yoruba headdress here on the left. And then I put in these contemporary pictures of the Gele just to show you how it's a contemporary translation. But again, this architecture here is iconic, it's monumental. This is what most Black design students would be doing in their school projects if they were focusing on drawing inspiration from their own environment. We all know this building. It was not African inspired. Beautiful building, however. I show this, and Professor David will show another image of this. I can't remember his name right now, but he's a graduate student from Unilag. And his design drew on the Yoruba headdress for the men, right? Very iconic. We would see more of these types of designs if we were focusing on that. This is a sketch of Echo Atlantic. We know this. Borrowed, beautiful skyline, very contemporary. Maybe we would be doing more skylines that look like this. This is an image from a gamer. You know how when all these video games and designers have to create sets for the background of these games. So this designer from Congo won first place for doing this design. It's very, very beautiful. It's animated. But another idea of creating architecture that makes a statement and gives a sense of place. Because after all, architecture is a translation of your culture, your aesthetics, your identity, your materials, spirituality, all of those things into the built environment. And so any culture would have an architectural language, or many architectural languages. In the case of Africa, there's so many ethnic groups, right? So another story I want to share that kind of connects these dots and the importance.
Thank you, Natalie.
Okay.
Before you share that story, we'll let you stop a bit here.
Okay.
While we're listening to Dr. Dean, we'll come back to you.
Awesome.
Thank you so very much. We'll come back to you. Hold on, Dr. Dean. Everybody will be having. Okay. Dr. Dean is with us. Like I told us before, he's an architect. He's a leading editor of Papyrus. Papyrus is a quarterly journal on the techniques of art and architecture in Africa. And he is the founder of neatspace.com, a portal for disseminating scientific and mathematical foundations of African art and architecture. He is the principal partner of Digitalite.inc. And today he'll be talking to us on the future of architecture and technologies in Africa. Dr. Dean, we're ready to listen. We're ready to listen to you.
Drive. Let me check. Zoom. Unilag is somewhere. Share screen. What's going on?
We can't see your screen.
Yeah, okay. That's why okay. I try to share. I click on share screen.
Okay, you can speak. I think I have my screen shared. I don't know if everyone can see it, but
Yes.
if they can see my screen, you can speak on using my screen.
Okay. So let me go on. So I need to come back to cancel.
Well, just speak through your screen.
I
have your first slide
I need to go to
on the
Zoom.
screen now.
Okay.
But
Okay, we can see you.
okay, but I see my own screen now.
Good.
It's yours.
Okay.
It's yours.
Yeah, this is mine. I'm sharing yours through mine. So go on.
Okay. Okay.
We'll walk through it now.
Put on show mode so that we don't need the thumbnail on the left.
I don't know how to do that.
Well, anyway, at
I don't know
least
how to do that.
reduce the size so people should see all the page.
Okay, let me try to do this. Like this?
Yes, 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 okay. Little bit more.
A little bit more? Okay.
No, a little bit bigger.
Okay. Like
bigger,
this?
bigger, bigger, bigger. Oh, yes, like that is good. Good.
Okay.
Anyway, I can start?
Yes, please, go on.
For 10 minutes, okay. So,
yeah.
I quote Devas Nwoko, a Nigerian scholar, who say, technology is universal, but aesthetic of art is unique to different cultures. Let's start from there. Move. Move. Okay. So I heard the term innovate. Innovate is a key word. And I borrow the meaning from the Bambara quote and from Saint-Exupéry, a French quote. People who say, the man who only creates is a man, and design is this challenge to African people today, not in the past, but today. How can we merge to the mainstream and manifest the supremacy of our culture? Next. Next. So, the way European scholars define architecture, starting by Frank Lloyd Wright of the 20th century, is architecture is a scientific art that makes structures express ideas. And finishing with Bruno Zevi, an Italian scholar in Europe, you see his quote, how to speak architecture. Modern architecture coincide with a modern way of looking at the architecture of the past. His message goes back as far back as the Paleolithic age. What is the Paleolithic age? Next. The canon of the Paleo-African art have been subject to a dissertation of Prof. George Nelson Preston from the College of New York, the City College of New York. He was talking about two sculptures from Africa, African descent, Arrojo from Brazil and Anasui from native of Ghana, and in fact from Nigeria, where they are the most important sculpture in the world today, using the Paleo-African art, the canon of the Paleo-African art. What is the canon of Paleo-African art? Next. The Paleo-African art is the caves of the Sahara, 50 centuries before pyramids. And this book is a thesis in France, written by a Berber lady who said the first art of the Africa, the art of the Negroes, has its roots in the Sahara, where you find the fundamentals of the mask, the statuary, and the color palette we use in today, more than 10,000 years before they use it. You see on the left, immediately, they have a writing at that time, 10,000 years before. So, nonetheless, Vitruvius from Roma reshaped this architecture, and today he defined architecture using in Caucasian schools as three components: utilitas, fermitas, and venustas. We're going to see what it means. But when you take utilitas, that is how we perform the spacing of our functional space, our use. You see at the top right how the people of Sudan use the 24 hours in their compound or house. At the bottom left, you see for the university campus of, say, 200 students, how they plan the use of space to get the highest ratio. We don't learn that in school. Architecture is first making things work. People call that performance. Next. After performance, you need to build structure. So the fermitas, you see on the left, fermitas from Latin word, means in fact the art of structure and materials. At Mogby Rural Studio in Alabama, you see how a branch of Auburn University, black area in Atlanta, use wood to create a fire station and other facilities in the rural area. You see that. Next. In fact, in the 80s, two French architects wrote a book they call Architecture of Africa, Vitalist Architecture. And they say the same way Negro art influenced the European Western art, the same way architecture will influence the Western art. But because African architect and African descent architect continue to copy, they claim that they are the only one to recreate the modern architecture under the canon of the Paleolithic of the Sahara. This is what they say. Next. Nonetheless, when Cubism started with the avant-garde Picasso and Le Corbusier 1 century ago, Le Corbusier was a painter. and Picasso sculptures, they were studying the mask and the layering techniques of African artists. Later on, by the end of the third decade of the 20th century, they moved from art to architecture. And you see how the cubist layering of a house. These are the fundamentals of modern architecture. Next. I am introducing you to that before I come to design computation, because people think that design computation is just calculation. You cannot compute something if you did not design the theory of this thing, how to generate that. You need to have a theory and then you compute. So Lionel March, one of the first architects in the modern world to be also a mathematician and a computer scientist, define modern architecture along with the canon of African Paleolithic architecture. This is what he said. The key term, order, complexity, set of elements and rules. As a scientist review that, he discovered a simple explanation for complex behavior. This is how they think African architecture creates unique events. In this view, he said, science and art are above aesthetic activities. Next. So, if I look at the spikes in the Djenné Mosque or the tomb of Askia in Nigeria, you cannot recreate this thing if today you don't have the digital tools. That's why I show above how from a digital tools called Revit, you can generate a skin with spike. We can discuss later why these spikes. And at the bottom, no, not too fast. No, before, yes, this one. This one is to show to African architecture that these are fundamental digital tools that they must master today if they even want to translate traditional African architecture into modern language. Next. So beyond the use of tools, you have the next layer called parametric design that make us make savings in time and energy to design complex objects. And they say here that this kind of design, these tools require thinking with abstraction, thinking mathematically, and thinking algorithmically. So the use of mathematics is in fact geometry at the higher level. And they say abstraction is the hardest new skill for designer. It involves thinking more like a computer scientist than a designer. So we need to learn to think algorithmically, because when we start doing with these tools, we can regenerate at this industrial age, our heritage. I visited the Technical Institute of Technology in Switzerland in 2009, my old school. I discovered in the lab all the wood they were doing and manufacturing from the digital fabrication. Next. And today, we can even move further since people are thinking settling in other planets, Mars, Moon. They start doing automatically construction. This is what technology is heading today. Next. So my dream is that the way you see this house with bamboo, local material, but you need a designer that conceive this in a computer before people can manufacture that in reality. That's why I pledge for looking at technology with a second view, a second way, because all the Western higher school in architecture are muting now to School of Design, not anymore School of Architecture. So I conclude saying that once the Dimas Nuko say technology is universal, it's really universal.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. Thank you so very much. I will move on to our last speaker for today in the person of Professor Babatunde Jayoba. Professor Babatunde Jayoba is a professor of architecture in the University of in Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife. His special interest is in housing, low-cost housing specifically. Though his research is quite multidisciplinary, so he looks at different areas like culture and other areas that affect architecture positively. You're welcome, Professor Jayoba. We're ready to listen to you. And he'll be talking to us on architectural design, culture, and the society. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you share my
Okay.
I'm trying to do so here too. Okay.
Let me try.
Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Yes.
I see your slide now.
Who's sharing? Am I the one sharing it?
I'm the one sharing it.
Okay, cool. Go on.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you all panelists. It's been an interesting thing that we are on to this afternoon. It's afternoon here in Nigeria. I'm going to speak on architectural design, culture, and society. And I think I'll be speaking more practically, like as someone that is on ground in Nigeria here. I think that the relationship between architecture and culture is actually supposed to be very straightforward, in that the built environment is made by people, and these people must belong to a society. And to write about the culture of a people, you examine their buildings. And also, to be able to write the history of a people, you must look at the buildings that have been built. But for us to actually infuse culture into architecture, we must highlight more the society-centric definition of architecture, or the things that are really society-based, because the human beings are from societies. Also, I've been looking at the forces that are against culture being adopted in the design of buildings. Then I'll be raising some questions that I know some of the people that join this cast will want to raise later. Then the way forward, and I'll mention a few cases, and the merits, what we can derive from a society-centric architecture. We've been talking about architecture as an art and a science, but what is usually not highlighted is that architecture is also a social science. And that's why it seems that people tend to underplay the cultural things that we are supposed to be infusing into our architecture. Architects have become less knowledgeable about philosophy, about anthropology, about many other things that are part of the culture visual and non-visual elements that are prominent in the society. For example, music, the drama, the dances, the textiles, the way people dress, the sculpture. Many people are no longer aware of this. So if this aspect of architecture is now highlighted more when we define architecture, then I think that more and more architects and people too may be able to understand architectural design in relation to culture. Now, what are the forces that are against all what we have been saying? That is really making use of culture in architectural design. We said we want a society-centric definition of architecture. The society itself, the way it is growing and developing, is working against the use of cultural elements, the use of culture itself in design. Many of us that are members of the society have become too modern, even to think about where we're coming from. What is our tradition? What is our culture? Many of us don't really understand this so much anymore. Now, if you look at even museums in the developing world, how much effort are we putting into getting cultural artifacts into our museums? How many really iconic museums or culturally iconic buildings do we have as museums in the developing world? That tells you that the society itself does not really put a primal role or a primal value to our culture. And then in terms of policies, I mean, recently many schools, for example, in Nigeria, history was taught in schools. How do you want students to even know about their tradition and their culture when you have taught history in schools? That's one of it. Then the other thing is that the parties to a project, to an architectural design, are many. You have the clients, you have the professionals, you have the users. How many of our clients, whether as individuals and as institutions, really desire cultural input into their brief? They're not too many. So the professionals that are on the field themselves are also not inspired, so to say, to have cultural input into their architectural design, because many of their clientele have lost touch even on these cultural issues. And all these is being attributed to globalization, modernization, civilization, and the likes, where the world has become a global village. Everybody wants his building in his corner in the village to look like the building in New York City. You want the building to look like the one in France or in Paris. You know, even the thought system of the clientele and the professionals has changed. And then multinational institutions and businesses, you know, like hotel chains, like banking chains, and all that, they are looking for buildings that are like international buildings rather than buildings that have. So these are all the forces that are working against cultural inputs into architectural design. Then what are the questions that arise as a result of this? How much of our societal culture do we really know? That's parties to an architectural design project. How much of societal culture or local culture is online? We have a lot of it online these days. Of course, much more has to be done. When Professor Hughes was in Zambia and traveling and studying African architecture in different places, how much of budget for research do we have in the developing world to do this kind of intensive research again? How much of societal culture is retained today in the way we live, in our way of life, in what we desire, in even our thinking? And how much of this culture is being taught in our schools, like Madili mentioned? There's very little of it that's been taught, and there may be no opportunities to do so. What is the way forward? We have to go back in time. Architects were philosophers. The root of art, science, and everything we're talking about is philosophy. Not only that, architects in the past sought to know almost everything about the society they're coming from, and even the society that they don't know. Then architects have to return to the role of being a universal man. It is true that these days, this is the age of specialization. But as much as possible, even if architects don't know, they must realize that they need multidisciplinary teams to address some issues about culture that they might not understand. Even in the planning of cities, in the to the planning of single units, there might be need for multidisciplinary teams. People that know about ethnography, people that know about all the other arts that we are not so vast in, to be able to inform whatever we do. And like the prof from Cameroon said, we have to examine again the definition of Vitruvius, that of commodity, firmness, and delight. Now, what aspects of culture is actually about functions? What aspects of culture?
Prof, we'll just give you a minute to round up. You've done your 10 minutes.
Structural stability and the rest
of
it. There are two case studies. I'm rounding up now. There are two case studies with contrasting effects in input of culture. The University of Ibadan, these are the two examples are in Nigeria. And then we have to look at the courtyard space itself, which is a common thing for all of African architecture. How has it been used in different contexts? And how can we use it in the present time? And of course, we know that once we are able to infuse culture into our architectural design, we are going to improve architecture. We're going to allow the society to benefit in terms of tourism, where the designer themselves will achieve better outlook, in terms of what we input into this society. And then we can also be well known, like earlier architects, about making use of our own culture into contemporary architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, panelists. We're indeed very grateful with all you've said, and the floor is now open to everybody, anyone who wants to ask a question. Thank you.
We might also, so thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah.
We might also be reading some questions from our chat.
Okay. If you just close that.
Hello.
Thank you.
Can I one of the questions for?
Yes, please go on.
Afternoon. Customers in Africa are unconsciously made to believe. Can you hear me, please? Consumer in terms of most goods and services. Foreign is being presented as better. How can we, as change the narrative? Maybe I'd like Professor Jayoba to respond to that.
Okay, can you unmute Madali, please?
Okay.
Can Professor Jayoba respond to that?
Okay. Okay, that customers in Africa are made to think that everything African is old.
Yes,
and is outdated.
Yes.
But, well, it is because sometimes we professionals we don't take charge of our clients and really educate them properly. You see, architects are supposed to be universal men, and we're supposed to possess a lot of knowledge about when someone says an idea is outdated. Already we know that a lot of African culture, African arts, even influenced the European masters. For example, Picasso was said to have been really, and Cubism was really informed by a lot of African art. And many of the things that were taken away from Nigeria or from Africa in terms of parts of buildings have become major things in the museums in Europe. So everything African cannot be said to be outdated. And it's not just in terms of the visual art, it's also in terms of the ideas. For example, when we're saying that we have problems in the developing world now, they're trying to study what causes social isolation in terms of the built environment. Now, our own architecture of the past solved the problem of social isolation. Now you have commissions coming to study African architecture in terms of being able to reduce social isolation in the developing world. So we have much more to offer the world than we can imagine, you know. So it is not true. We need to really educate our clients and take control, because we are supposed to be more knowledgeable about many of these things.
Thank you, Professor Madali. I think you might need to jump in here, because there's a question about how are we, what improvements are being made to make our traditional materials more durable and appealing. So someone thinks, an architect feels they're not appealing or they're not durable enough. What do you think?
Okay, well, luckily for us, we have someone on ground who's already solved this problem. I mean, his name has been said so many times already. Imaswonko. I mean, his factory in his hometown, Idumujiboko in Delta State. I mean, it's a must see, it's a must visit. He's already worked out the issues of standardizing our clay, right? And other materials. We have organizations in Nigeria, not NIBRI, I think it's NIBRI, that's mandated to work on these issues. So you just need to do those. Architects need to specify them in their works. There are too many examples worldwide that show how others have standardized local building materials that are African, and they're using them, right? From the Spanish, you know, others who are doing rammed earth, people are doing it. People are doing our own architecture better than us. So we can actually learn from outside. And about, again, focus on it in schools. Our schools are supposed to be research labs. We're supposed to be there working out these issues in faculties of construction, architecture, real estate. We're supposed to be working out these issues in schools so that when we graduate, we are bringing that knowledge, professional world, bringing it to our clients. Policymakers are making policy where you're not going to get a building approval if your designs don't meet standard. And that is, you are using the materials, you're using them well, and you're reflecting the culture in your design. You want people to be comfortable, right? So the spaces that you're designing and the materials that you're using, it's sustainable for them on all levels, whether it's urban or rural. So it's being done. I know Unilag, I know that some schools in Nigeria are working on this. But yeah, standardizing our materials, we just need to promote that more. And again, Dimas Wonko is already ahead of the game.
Thank you, Madeleine. Prof, I would love Professor Hughes to share his thought on this question. Someone is saying the practitioners who want to have their work who want to produce new Afrocentric work are unaware of the need to be global. And he's looking at this in line with the Black Lives Matter and says it's high time architecture, as in the Black architects and architecture from the Black frontier, is part of that big movement. What do you think about this, Prof? That some of the architects we have today are not even aware of this global community of materials and traditions. What can be done?
Well, I wouldn't say that. You're going to hear from me over a broad spectrum of ideas, which sometimes sound like contrasting or conflicting opinions, because there's an old saying that to be a great architect, you have to have great clients. And what we found throughout our world, if you will, besides history, just even present, is that a lot of our own people don't want their own architects who would, and particularly if you were to argue that your origins of thought come from your own culture. So we're still fighting a battle against, the ingrained mind. And that's why I wanted to say from the beginning, Afrocentric architecture is a two-part title. It's the architecture, but it's also what is Afrocentric. Afrocentricity was coined by Dr. Molefi Kete Asante out of Temple University, and he was born an African American, so that was not his original or given name at birth, but he took that on. But everything he wrote about the theory or the foundation of Afrocentricity was that you have to stop thinking like the West. I'm going to just take one piece because as both a professor and a critic, we can exchange ideas amongst ourselves. And by the way, I want to mention to my good friend, Dr. Dean, that was an extraordinary presentation. I've heard him on a number of occasions, and he sometimes tends really go into a number of different directions at the same time. This time he was focused, and I was very impressed. But I've never had the opportunity to exchange with Mr. Babatunde there, but I want to say something that you said to show you what I'm talking about, thinking Afrocentrically. You said that sometimes we, as either Black architects or as architects, are too modern to focus on our culture. And I thought immediately when you said that, I said, that is the perfect example of missing the forest for the trees. Because what you've decided was that modern means the absence of culture. And if you believe that, you have 100% bought into the Western idea that everything they do is universal, is international, is devoid of anything that they might refer to as tribal or focused on a particular belief or past or history, and that's absolutely untrue. If you really read them beyond just their architecture, and you look, if you go to their presentations, because I've been to the presentations of almost the whole gamut of the named architects across the 20th century, going all the way back to, Buckminster Fuller. And listen, they borrow 100% from their past, but it is their past. And they have convinced the world that their world is the universal world, is the international world, is the very essence of modernity. And it's not. It's just simply their culture being continuously, presented, to everybody else, and everybody else is convinced this is what you have to do if you want to be modern. So don't believe that there is no focus on culture. Just understand that you've been trapped in the belief that their culture is the only one that matters. And you know what? They're so funny that, and Modley and I have seen this now, this recent explosion throughout the Western world on the importance of African architecture. But the way they're doing it is they are deciding that, okay, if it's gonna be important to the world of scholarship, we have to write it. We have to dictate it. We have to decide who are gonna be the promulgators of this new thought, so that in the end, you're gonna think that anything that ever came out of African architectural thought was written and decided and determined by them. And we still have that mindset that if they don't tell you that it's important, then it's not important. And that's what we have. The greatest attack is against our own mentality.
Thank you, Prof. That's awesome. Thank you, Prof. Professor Dean, Dr. Dean, finally, can you take up this question? And I'll come back to Professor Tunde Jayoba. And someone has said the academic structure for architecture here in Africa, let me put it in Africa, but in Nigeria, solely Nigeria, that the structure does not make culture a major part of the sustainable solutions. So how much is this happening across Africa? In Cameroon, can you tell us what's happening with the curriculum and how they've tried to put in culture in it? Do you have any of that case studies to share with us?
If you want to create a school of architecture in Cameroon or elsewhere, you are expecting to receive grant and fund for the Western world. So they dictate to you the curriculum. In French Africa, it's even worse. You cannot define your own curriculum if the French don't give you permission. So that's why, as a Cameroonian, I decided to move to America 20 years to educate my kids the other way. But nonetheless, we need to acknowledge this. In America, the university system allow African to create African studies in USA university. Second, during the Bush administration, the Secretary of Education wrote a note to request that design be introduced into school K-12. That is, you teach mathematics through design. You teach reasoning, critical thinking through design. And at last, if I take the case of Atlanta, where I were, the chapter of the AIA, Architect of Atlanta, give awareness to students by creating competition in middle school, and architecture and design field are open to the American youth. In Africa, when you get your high school degree, you discover what I'm going to do. You go to the school of architecture, you got understanding what is architecture, and less African architecture. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. Professor,
I am a little bit cautious.
Okay, Professor Jayoba, in the Nigerian situation where we have NIA, we have ARCON, and we have you know, the architects, and then we have NUC. We'll look at all this curriculum. How do you think we can restructure our architecture to have culture as part of its curriculum? Because in Ghana, when you're in year 2 or 3, you take out your IT, or you take out a time to go into the indigenous areas and see how they build and practicalize it. So is there any plan towards this in Nigeria?
All right, thank you very much. I just want to put in a quick comment to what Professor Hughes said. It's not that I believe in that. I was only speaking from the point of view of the professional. I have a paper on the search for African identity, you know, that will be coming out as a chapter in a book soon. And I elaborated more on the search for African identity in architecture. Now, talking about curriculum, initially, a lot of what is taught as, or what was taught as history of architecture in Nigeria was actually European history of architecture. But of course, these days, a lot of history that is vernacular architecture and traditional architecture is now part of the curriculum of most schools that that at least have seen the curriculum. The only thing that is absent, I'll say right now, is that practical aspect of actually going into the field, you know, the time to actually go into the field, you know, to experience the traditional way of building, so to say. And of course, like Madili said, a lot of advancements in these materials we're already aware of, and they are documented, and they are actually being taught in schools. I think the main reason why many of these culture-infused ideas have not been used is kind of environmental, societal, like I mentioned earlier. Of course, there's also a lack of creativity in looking into these materials and techniques and really using them in modern ways and interpreting them to solve contemporary problems. I think that's, and we also need our professionals to be really bold and not be afraid to be tagged traditional architects or something. They need to be bold and express themselves. And I think sometimes some of these decisions might also be economic, a kind of survival instinct, you know, to belong and survive in the environment. So the curriculum is there theoretically in terms of knowing about these materials and techniques. It is practically going into the field to study them and implement them that is really the problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions, please, from our audience? Hello? Okay. I think we had a long day with our panelists. We have some other questions that time might not allow us to take now, but we will surely find a way to get those questions to you and let you take some more time to reply and dwell on it. I want to thank Professor David Hughes, Madili Okwambua, Dr. Dean, and Professor Jayoba. We appreciate your time, and we will be on again next week on another topic to deal more on architecture, the local architecture, and ornamentation afterwards. So we will be requiring to join us again. Thank our numerous audience for coming on. It's goodbye from us, from the Architecture and Urbanism Research Hub. Thank you very much for today. God bless you.